Welcome to IP Goes Pop, your source for exploring the interface between intellectual property and pop culture. The IP Goes Pop podcast series is created and produced by Volpe Koenig, an intellectual property law firm based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Visit us at vklaw.com. This program should not be considered legal advice. Please consult an attorney for your specific situation. And now your hosts, intellectual property attorneys, Michael Snyder and Joseph Gushue.
Hello, cheers, and welcome, listeners of IP Goes Pop, the podcast that asks the sometimes musical and sometimes non-musical question, what is this all about in this TV show or movie, about a patent or a trademark or a copyright? What are they talking about, and why are they talking about it at the same time I want to be entertained? We're going to get into that today. Joining us, as always, our co-host at IP Goes Pop, Joe Gushue. Hello, Joe, and welcome back.
Hi, Mike. Really excited to get into this topic with everyone today.
Of course, the name of the show today is Down in the Silicon Valley. We're really going to enter the world of startups and tech. Before we do, I also want to introduce fellow shareholder Ryan O'Donnell. Ryan, welcome.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Now, is this your first time on IP Goes Pop?
This is my first time on IP Goes Pop, so looking forward to it.
Well, you already sound like a natural, so buckle up. We're going to have a good time. I do want to say before we set the table, this podcast is not legal advice. That's our disclaimer. If you need legal advice, please seek out an attorney. And with that being said, let's go down into the Silicon Valley. Setting the table, the topic of this week is the TV series Silicon Valley, which was on the air from 2014 to 2019. And it told the story of a startup, which I guess, Joe, to summarize it, they were really in compression, I would say, would be their area, right? Both video and audio compression.
That's right, yeah. And main character, Richard Hendricks, played by Thomas Middleditch, which seen him in a number of different comedy shows since this series started, really focused on him as the main character. He was an engineer who came up with an idea for his own company while he was working in Silicon Valley in one of those startups.
And really, it's the tale of a startup facing a lot of the bumps in the roads and the financing and what's great for our podcast, the IP issues. Just wanted to run down some of the characters, Joe, and kind of get your take or summary on them. So we already talked about kind of Richard Hendricks, the leader of Pied Piper, the CEO, your nervous, anxiety-filled genius, I would say, who kind of learned business along the way. Of course, Thomas Middleditch, as you said, known both for his commercials and also it's fun to catch these characters in other shows they're in their career and say, oh, look, it's Richard from Silicon Valley. Then there was Josh Brenner, who played Big Head, his kind of less...
The guy who fails upward.
Yeah.
He just kept not the brightest bulb of the engineers there, but somehow just stumbling into greater and greater success.
I think he ultimately became an accidental professor at Stanford at some point.
Yes, that is correct.
And he was upset about it. And then there's Martin Starr, who plays Guilfoyle, one of the darker, more sarcastic characters. But if you know him, he actually is now in the MCU, in the Marvel Universe, as the teacher in the Spider-Man series.
Spider-Man, Far From Home. And he was also in Party Down, another excellent comedy series. There's not a whole lot about intellectual property issues in Party Down, but that's where I saw him first. And then his, I guess, frenemy on the show was Dinesh, who's played by Kumail Nanjiani. And he's also going to be in a Marvel movie.
That's right.
Be immortal. So all these guys, doesn't matter where you start, comedy, action, anywhere, you're going to be in a Marvel movie at some point. So that was the first time I was introduced to him. He's been in a number of movies since.
The other important lead character would be Matt Ross as Gavin Belson, who is the self-loving, narcissistic CEO of Hooli, which represents, I guess, any very large tech company. It could be any. It's not really any one in particular, but he's kind of an amalgam of different big personalities, and he'll come into play. But I think what's interesting, and Ryan, I want to bring you in here. When you look at the show, all of the beats of the episodes of this series, they match up to what goes on with real world startups and the challenges they face, from funding to running into IP issues. I know, Ryan, you've worked with some startups. Do you find the show to be fairly realistic?
Well, they really get themselves in trouble, but I do think it is realistic from the point that each episode they are solving a different problem. They are like any startup company. They have a lot of resource needs. They seem to run into a lot of problems in trying to achieve some of their objectives. So yeah, I do think the show is somewhat representative of typical startup companies in the tech space.
When we have startup companies approach us who are in any kind of tech world, whether it's the Internet of Things or some fancy gadget, something, some kind of a website related business, of course, there's always funding issues in the beginning. And a lot of times the funders or the venture capital types want to see and want to know if they truly do have, some kind of IP portfolio. And I'm talking above and beyond Shark Tank, where one of the sharks will say, "Do you have a patent?" And then they'll say, "We sure do." And then they'll all kind of smile and nod their heads. Like, it could be a design patent, provisional patent application. They don't ask if they're getting a patent. They just said they filed something. So I think they're going to go into more detail. But I want to take us into the first episode that we're going to talk about from the show, where they really, of course, as IP practitioners, there's not that many times when a TV show focuses specifically on IP issues. And the name of this episode is actually intellectual property. So it's going to be very hard on IP Goes Pop to find something as right on point and in the wheelhouse of the show. So this is season 4, episode 3. I guess, Ryan, can you take us through kind of a summary of the episode before we break down the issues?
So this episode starts out pretty light. Richard, he has a great compression algorithm. He's trying to solve the startup problem of where can I apply this best? And one of the things he's trying to do is to create a new type of open internet. He finds that one of his mentors had been looking at the same problem years before, and he further learns that this mentor collaborated with his arch nemesis, Gavin Belson, and that Gavin Belson wanted to block the mentor from pursuing this new internet idea. So Gavin Belson and some of his partners filed a patent application to get Richard's mentor sort of off track, to block him from pursuing his idea. And lo and behold, Gavin Belson now has the rights to the patent, and Richard decides that he needs to approach Gavin to solve this problem of how to continue to practice his invention in view of this patent that could block him.
And I will say to people who haven't watched the show ended in 2019, but there are spoilers on this episode. We actually haven't had to say that on that because, Joe, you and I usually talk about movies that are decades old. So there are spoilers here, but still, we're not going over the whole plot. We're just going over the IP plot. I really urge people to watch the show. It's really well done, and the characters are really well-formed characters. So here you have two arch enemies effectively in the business world. And imagine having the greatest idea that is going to become the centerpiece of your career and finding out that your arch enemy has a patent. But I want to pick through a couple of things that Ryan talked about, starting with, I was trying to follow this fact pattern. So Richard's mentor came up with this, but then another group of people appeared to have filed a patent on it. And Joe, I just wanted to talk, we've touched on inventorship, but I would have to assume that if they had filed on someone else's idea, I mean, it's just an invalid patent.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Like one of the things about patent law, in order to file a patent, you need to contribute to the claims. So you would really have to look at that. But there's no inventing being done if you're taking someone's idea at a high level and running with it. So that would cause an issue with that and lead to an invalid patent, number one, with the inventorship issue. And something else is, Richard, I believe in that episode, confused the patent number with a phone number.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
to do a quick turn in not knowing what a patent even was or looked like to needing immediately wanting to run and get a license to make sure he could use it, that he became educated quite quickly in what a patent actually was. But you really find in pop culture and then even talking with people, they'll mention, oh, there's a patent on this. And the media reaction is rats. I can't do anything with that. But what you should really do is look and see what the patent actually covers. Richard never really looked at the claims of this particular patent and saw what was actually there, because that's what you actually do have rights to. Everything else in the patent is the specification that'll describe the idea, but ultimately what you have protected is what's covered in the claims there at the end.
First of all, this is surprising. It's the first time Richard seems to have ever seen a patent, perhaps. But what I always tell people is, it's at the end of a patent are these numbered paragraphs, and it's almost like a deed to a house that tells you exactly what corner the lot goes from, that's attached to your deed. And that's really what the claims of the patent are. They're telling you the property that you've carved out and kind of gotten a contract from the government with. But so, Ryan, let's say I'm going to run this fact pattern from the show. Someone has what they believe is a groundbreaking idea. They want to go forward with it. They're going to invest a lot in it. They find a patent which appears to, at first glance, broadly cover the idea. Should they, I'm going to ask it this way, should they run to the house in the middle of the night of the owner of the patent, tell them how valuable it is, basically get hijacked for a license, or do they have other options? I'm curious here.
We burn down the house in the act, but there are other options in the real world. So, some of the things you can do, one of the starting places is, first of all, you want to see if the patent has some term left. Patents generally have a 20-year term. And in this case, the story was that this patent was developed when Gavin Belson's company was sort of young. So it would lead you to believe that perhaps patent term could have been one way to avoid having to take a license if the patent was expired or about to expire. A couple other things you can look at is sort of what Joe just mentioned. You certainly want to look at the claims to see if the claims of the patent are even directed towards what you want to do. And then the last thing is you can always look to see if the patent is invalid based on some references that may have been out there before the patent issued. So that's something, if you're savvy, you can do a little bit of searching yourself to see if you can find some references that possibly predate the patent.
So there's at least three ways that Richard could have gone to a negotiation armed with better information than he had, right? So one of those is to really look and study the claims of the patent and say, okay, what does this actually cover? A lot of times reading the specification, which are all the detailed description of a patent, they look very broad, and they're actually written to read very broadly. Sometimes, though, when you get to the end and you look at the claims, they're not quite as broad as you thought originally. And one of the things, for example, people may come to a patent practitioner and say, how do I get around this patent? Can I do something different? Joe, is it possible, even if there is an issued patent, like in this case, is it possible to get around it by maybe doing things a little differently?
Oh, yeah, definitely, Mike. I mean, depending on how specific the language is there, if you ever find yourself in one of these situations, you can consult with a patent attorney and then come up with maybe a couple different options to do things slightly differently. May not be as optimized, but if it does the job at the end of the day, that would be what we call working around a particular patent. That's why a lot of people, for valuable ideas like this, like to keep the prosecution of their patents open, meaning filing additional patents on the same idea. Something you do with the patent office. It doesn't extend your term at all, but you're able to keep tweaking the language there that you have in your patents in what would be a patent family. And you're able to make adjustments to things as you see how industry evolves or other competitors. Of course, other patents you may file aren't worth that, but this is getting quite technical into the field of patent law, but it's something that we'll run into a lot in the real world, not necessarily on HBO's Silicon Valley.
Yeah. By the way, we didn't even mention my favorite character, which is played by Zach Woods, which is Jared.
I think Jared would come up with some killer 102 prior art and be like, all right, here we go, Richard. We're fine. This isn't a valid patent. He's that type of helper.
I would think that or Guilfoyle would discover some dark secret about one of the inventors, and they would meet at a restaurant and kind of blackmail them in the context of the show, which did almost happen in a different episode that didn't involve, I think actually it involved privacy. So it was in the IP realm. It also shows you the value of patents that this whole season of Silicon Valley, which was season 3, circled around this patent and allowed Gavin Belson to kind of become a player again after he was kicked out of Hulu. So it also shows you, even with one patent, you could have tremendous bargaining power. Speaking of one patent, I'm going to shift to the episode of Silicon Valley called Patent Trolls, which actually is a pejorative term for a person or a company that has a patent and seeks to license that patent. Now, I don't see anything wrong with that. I know that there are some negative things written, but obviously, making a patent is somewhat like making a product, except the product that you're making is technology. So it's no different than trying to monopolize an industry by controlling it with all the products that you sell. Here it is a legal monopoly in a way, which makes it a little bit different. But let's see, Ryan, do you want to tell the story of this particular episode?
I think it was called the Holy 500 App Store for the first time. And as soon as they hit that 500 list, they get a letter in the mail from the patent troll in this episode. Instead of consulting with a lawyer right away, Richard decides he's just going to knock on the door and approach this gentleman. I do got to say, he is the sweetest patent troll I've ever seen portrayed. He's very friendly, had a great story, talked about how he acquired the patent and some other intellectual property that he acquired before and was able to license and make a lot of money. But in the end, he told Richard, here's a very low amount that you can be the first to license for. And I'm basically working my way up the list of 500 and you happen to be 500. So you're going to get the low value, take it while you can get sort of a cheap license right now. Richard, after that, does consult an attorney. The attorney sort of agrees that that's a low value and you might want to just fold the tent and take the license instead of fighting, because that could cost substantially more money and resources. And Richard tries to get a little creative, tries to actually assemble the people at the bottom of the Holy 500 list to see if they will all chip in money to fight against the patent. And the sort of perplexing thing is he asked everybody to chip in $20,000, which is the licensing amount, to fight the patent. And then lo and behold, everybody in this consortium goes and takes a license behind Richard's back. And now the license value is even higher for Richard if he wanted to seek a license.
I definitely think a lot of the show as it went through showed how negotiations works and how until people have experience in these type of negotiations, they usually make it much worse for themselves. And one other thing, Joe, in pop culture, do you recognize the attorney, Pied Piper's attorney from other shows, that actor?
Oh, yeah, he's in Mad Men,
right,
among other things.
And he stars in Superstore, more recent.
That's been one of your pandemic watches, I think.
That's one of my. Right? It's one of Mike's pandemic picks has been Superstore, along with catching up on Brooklyn Nine-Nine. But which, by the way, neither of those will have any IP issues that I could tell from my binge watching so far. But Ryan, let's go back. So first of all, let's assume the patent covered what Pied Piper was doing. And with that being the case, then I guess, Ryan, can you do this for me? I'm going to give you a little task right here for the show. Go through from cost of negotiation and kind of a cease and desist letter and a back and forth, what that could potentially run, assuming that the patent covers what you're doing, going from that to studying the patent to see if you could invalidate it, to what would happen in a lawsuit, to some kind of patent challenge, just so the listener understands the range of costs here and why maybe Richard was a little bit foolhardy to try. He basically was proceeding from justice and what is right, and he didn't like it as a business per se, without understanding the ramifications. So if you could walk through all of those from, again, responding to a cease and desist letter and negotiating, to studying the patent, getting into a lawsuit, to challenging the patent.
So just responding to a cease and desist letter, It's usually not that simple. There's usually quite a bit of back and forth. So, you're sort of paying an attorney to feel out one another, see how aggressive the patent owner is going to be. That doesn't work. You move on to wanting to now get into a more thorough study of the patent. And that cost can be, a little bit more substantial. So the cost of studying a patent, you're really looking at it from two lenses. One to see if you infringe, meaning you read your product is within the scope of the claims. That could be, $10,000 to $20,000. And then you may also want to do an invalidity search and review of what's called prior art, meaning references that existed before or earlier than the patent. That could cost another $10,000 to $20,000. So with the negotiation and these studies, you could be, $50,000 plus in. If you make the decision to enter a suit, the current average for patent lawsuits for small companies is around $750,000 to take a matter to trial in attorney's fees. And then you can also be faced with some other fees like experts and court costs and things like that. So it's not a cheap endeavor.
Well, when you hear that, I mean, that's obviously Richard didn't know any of that, or no one told him or couldn't stop him. So it could be pretty expensive to just try to be right instead of understanding the value, especially if assuming here that the patent in this episode actually covered what they did. And I do think, even though they use the term patent troll here, so Ryan, like you set up the show, I mean, the person who approached them was eminently reasonable and had something of value. So again, I think it's coming through. I'm not happy with this term patent troll. I think it's kind of silly. I think, people in business are grown-ups, and I'm sure it was coined by a company that was, upset that it had to pay anything to settle out of a patent matter. But, patents are valuable. I mean, I think that's one of the lessons here. In the end, I guess, how did it end up? I mean, did he pay the higher amount? I don't remember.
No, in the end, it got a little complicated, but Richard was able to outsmart him, not having to do with this particular patent, but based on one of the stories that this sweet gentleman was telling him, how in the past he made a lot of money off of copyrights and licenses to copyrights. And Richard was able, through his compression algorithm, able to find a way to convince this gentleman that his copyright licenses could be at stake based on some potential copyright infringement issues that he raised with the, quote unquote patent troll. And in the end, the patent troll walked away.
That also is somewhat reminiscent of another reason to have something in your IP portfolio. Here, he was relying on kind of third-party information. But many times when a company gets a cease and desist letter or a licensing letter saying, our patent covers you, if the other company is a competitor, they will also look through their files and their patent portfolio and see if they have something that they never enforced and that covers what the accuser is doing. So sometimes it ends up being, cross licensing or a battle of patents. So it is valuable to have something in the mix. And a lot of times people look through the deck of what they're holding, and maybe they have an ace in the hole. Maybe they have a more valuable patent. Also, I like that they use the technology in the context of the show. Of course, in the background the whole time are Guilfoyle and Dinesh going at each other, which again is, we didn't even mention TJ Miller as Ehrlich Bachman, who had one big payout in the kind of earlier days of tech startups and kind of rode that for the rest of, at least for the rest of the show, if not his life.
Right. Yeah. In one of the episodes we were talking about today, he was selling an app called Seafood. And Seafood he was basically morphing into anything that the investors wanted to hear. So it was pretty amusing.
I'm sure that happens too. But then when it comes down to it, I know that they wanted to see working technology. And that's when it kind of blew the lid off his con, if you will. Another issue that came up from one of the episodes was what we call works made for hire. Now, it's sometimes people hear the term, but don't know precisely what it means under the law. Works made for hire is actually in the Copyright Act, but people often think of it as anything someone does for an employer. Who would like to take the lead on kind of the summary of this particular episode?
Yeah, so this is sort of a culmination, I think, of season 2, to be quite honest. But Richard, he is threatened with losing his entire company based on, at one time, for a very short period, or maybe one instance, he used a Hooli computer to test his algorithm. At one point, Richard was a Hooli employee in the show, and the show made clear that he was using his own resources, his own time, and doing something a little different when he created Pied Piper. However, I believe his laptop died, and he had to use his work laptop just to run one test on his compression algorithm. And in the show, that threatened the entire existence of Pied Piper. And again, another problem that Richard faced, and he was able to come up with, kind of got lucky to survive this difficult issue.
I think another concept here that's important is something known as, let's talk about two things. First of all, works made for hire really relates to, in the copyright world, which does cover software, if you are, as an employee, hired to create a certain thing, or you're part of research and development, then automatically and I'm summarizing a lot of complicated copyright law, but automatically under the law, your employer would own the work that you create. And I think that's what they were stressing here. Now, there's another issue called shop rights. And what that talks about is, aside from works for hire, if on your employer's time you are inventing something, even if it's outside of the particular scope of your job, but you're using your employer resources and time, then sometimes the employer could say that they have a right to use whatever you come up with because you actually did it while you were effectively at work and not outside of work. So, people who want to have a project that's outside of their work that they are hired for you shouldn't use, company resources, company computers, of course. You shouldn't do it at the time that the company is, operates for business. So that's kind of the shopwright type of issue here as well. But I did want to mention, so Volpe Koenig did a webinar. It was called The Revolving Door: Intellectual Property Issues for Incoming and Outgoing Employees and Contractors. I guess what applies there to Richard's scenario, especially let's talk about the outgoing. So let's say he was a short-lived employee. He had some kind of employment agreement. It probably, it did have an IP clause, but kind of on the way out the door, what could Hooli have done that we covered in our webinar to put themselves in a better position? Also, that's not better for the show. That's just better for our discussion.
Well, I think Richard, before even doing some of this work on the side, should have really taken a close look at his employment agreement, because he's working for Hooli, a very large internet company, and he's then working on his compression algorithm, which would seem to be related to some of the work that he's doing while he was hired by Hooli. But Hooli, to put themselves in a better spot, needs to conduct an exit interview, do their due diligence, and see what work Richard was working on, and keep records regarding the different projects he was associated with, perhaps even save the computer that he had for a set amount of time to see if there were any files that he accessed or used in the creation of his compression algorithm, and then just educated Richard that he really cannot use some of the confidential information he obtained at Hooli in future endeavors that he would go on to after leaving the company. Did I get everything there, Ryan, or anything?
I think you probably hit it all, but I'll stress the confidential information point is really a strong thing to focus on. It's important for the employer here, Hooli, particularly. You can do it during an exit interview, but you do want to go over the confidential information that Richard may have received at Hooli and make it clear to Richard that he's not to use that in any of his future endeavors. Here in the show, we don't know if Hooli did any of that. And we don't really even know how strong any of the contract language was that Richard may or may not have agreed to. But again, makes for good TV and an interesting episode.
And refresh my recollection here. Was this an episode where his attorney was somehow disgraced and came out of retirement, or was under investigation? Or am I thinking of another? Maybe I'm thinking of another show.
No, he did have one episode they were in court. I can't recall the issue that brought them there, but his attorney was very accomplished, but then I believe had a some sort of substance abuse problem and was a bit disgraced. And that's how Richard was able to hire him.
Okay. That's what I'm thinking. And by the way, putting it all together, I think it was the same actor that played Lloyd Braun on Seinfeld.
It's another sale, Mr. Costanza. Yeah, I think you are right, Mike.
That's right. He was in a war with George Costanza over who could sell more computers, speaking of Silicon Valley. And George won the contest by buying all the computers himself to prove that he could sell more computers out of a garage.
To get his father's love. And then Lloyd Braun was never selling any computers. And he kept ringing a bell when they did make a sale.
So no wonder he ended up here. Well, that's our time for this week. We covered, as always, a lot of ground, but we got to go pretty deep into what is a really tech-savvy and tech-related show, which is really interesting. It doesn't come up that much. It may never come up again. I would urge people who are in startups, if you want to watch a TV show that kind of, again, takes you through from the early days to the issues as you are getting, bigger and more intense type of issues in funding, it's a great show to check out. And you'll recognize so much of it, from the VCs to the interviewing to the funding to the patent issues to the trademark issues. So I guess, Ryan, any last thoughts?
I agree. Keep watching the show if you want a good Netflix series to go back and watch. It's certainly an interesting one. There's quite a few articles on the internet that says that this show makes patent attorneys sort of go a little nuts because we kind of pick apart all the issues, but it is certainly interesting.
Yeah, but Brian, on that point, can you imagine how people in law enforcement feel about all the detective shows that go on?
Doctors and doctor shows.
Right. It's finally our turn, I guess.
Yeah, as doctors kind of rush without doing any sterilization, rush into an operating room and just start doing things to someone on the table and grabbing instruments and saying, "Don't you die on me, not today, not on my watch."
Not again.
Right. But Joe, any last thoughts on the show?
Yeah, I think whenever you see patents or hear, sometimes when you're on the internet, you'll say, this company has a patent on this. And you'll see it's a publication and not a patent. That's something to always keep in mind. I think that gets people mix that up a lot, because a publication is just the idea itself before it gets actually examined, and the claims have to potentially get changed. And then you can see what the patent actually is. Claims being important, the patent troll issues, it was pretty interesting. Richard went from immediately needing a license when he saw a patent the first time to saying, "Why do I need a license for this patent?" a little bit later in the series, which is a bit of an about face. So, just always get a patent attorney involved at the earliest point where you think you have a patent issue with things. But like Mike was saying, Silicon Valley, I think they could have done a little bit better getting some patents of themselves, because that'll put them in much better positions in just navigating the business world, both offensively and defensively when you're approached. Then the last thing, work's made for hire. If you are in a tech field and you're doing any kind of work that makes you think your employment agreement could contain some information that impacts your side hustle or anything like that, it's probably best to talk to a contract attorney, employment attorney, or even IP attorney to see how to best navigate that, because these are issues that do come up all the time. Just so happen to come up in an HBO series here, but it always gives us some more material to cover in this podcast. And I'm glad the series came out like this.
I agree with everything that was said. And my takeaway is, people, do some due diligence. Don't run to someone's doorstep, especially who has an incredible advantage as a billionaire. Don't run to someone's doorstep and just say, "You have me right where you want me, and I'm here to beg." Do some due diligence, do your homework, bring in people who are experts, who could help you, whether technical experts or legal experts or business experts. Try to build your team as a startup as early as possible. And, with that, let me say, from all of us here at IP Goes Pop, as we say every week, keep watching everything that's streaming, listening to music, watching movies. And now you can actually perhaps go back to the movies. So enjoy that. And we will see you next time on IP Goes Pop.
The IP Goes Pop podcast series is created and produced by Volpe Koenig, an intellectual property law firm based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Visit us at vklaw.com.